Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest installation of All Tech is Humans live stream series. It's a bi-monthly live stream series where we tackle the world's thorniest tech and society issues. Today, I'm really excited to bring on Natalie Monbiot, a expert around the concept of virtual humans. You might have seen a lot in the news, especially around the areas like character AI and potential harm that could happen about these interactions. But then we're also obviously going to get into its potential for upsides. Everything we do at All Tech is Human is really around the idea of how do we better align technology with our human interests around connection, a thriving democracy, and how we connect with one another, right? All Tech is Human, we are a nonprofit committed to tackling these thorny tech and society issues, and we do that through collective understanding, collective involvement, and lastly, action. There's a tremendous amount of ways that you can get involved if you're not involved today. Right now, I'm your host, the founder and president of All Tech is Human, David Ryan Polgar. I'm sitting here in Manhattan, but we have a global audience, for example, on our Slack community that you can join. We currently have, I think we just crossed 12,000 members across 105 countries. We also have regular mixers and summits in cities such as New York, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and London. And outside of that, we have our new ATIHX program, which are independently organized gatherings that are happening all across the globe. For example, yesterday we had the first ATIHX that happened in Barcelona. And then last week there was one in Toronto, the week before, one in Paris. So a lot of different activity. So wherever you're tuning in from, there's a spot for you to find other people, all different backgrounds, who deeply care about co-creating a better tech future, one that's aligned with the public interest. I'm going to just bring on Natalie in a moment, but what I will say too is to get involved with All Tech is Human, please just go to alltechishuman.org. You'll see all our different activities that go across 3 different pillars of community building, education, and careers, such as our very popular Responsible Tech job board and our talent pool, and then our newsletters that you can sign up. We have a regular one that's bi-monthly and a new one just dedicated towards responsible tech careers. Why do we do this? We need a broad range of people, all different backgrounds, disciplines, and lived experiences, so we can better think through the complexity of these tech and society issues that are, again, benefit from a collective understanding, involvement, and action. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on Natalie. Hello, Natalie. How are you doing?
Hi, David. I'm great. Thank you. Fantastic to be here.
Well, I really appreciate it because I know we've had the chance to meet up at a few different gatherings. I think we met first at the British Consulate in New York, where both of us are based. As a little bit of background, one of the things that certainly impressed is you're kind of a pioneer in this space of the concept of virtual humans, and then currently running as the founder of Virtual Human Economy, where you advise startups, brands, VC funds, and others. Tell us a little bit more about your background before we get this conversation started.
Absolutely. So for most of my career, I've been a media and emerging media strategist and led teams such as at Universal McCann. I was the digital lead about 12 years ago at this point, so quite a while ago. And sort of in the last 5 years, I sort of defected from the corporate world to help found one of the first AI avatar startups, Hour One. So, had an absolute field day kind of thinking through from the inception of this technology, the ability to kind of recreate a human in video without having to use a camera, and all the ethical dilemmas that come with that, how to navigate trust, especially when you're trying to commercialize this technology in a way that is great for businesses, that's great for consumers. How do you prove the value of this technology while making it feel safe and trustworthy? So I spent the last sort of 5 or so years focused on that. And in the last 6 months, I've sort of stepped out on my own as an independent advisor in this space. working closely with startups that kind of fulfill my vision, which is the virtual human economy, which is a future and a present where we can create AI twins that we can put to work on our behalf to live more productive and more fruitful lives. And even though where I come from in regards to this space is sort of AI avatars, sort of visual, virtual human interfaces, my interest is much broader than that. And I think of AI twins as, any sort of aspect of replication of yourself that can be, your likeness, how you look, how you sound. But I think what's increasingly interesting, and for many more valuable, is the ability to replicate your expertise. So to replicate your most valuable assets, which might be what you know, and how you think, and to be able to even take advantage of sort of the properties of digital and AI to actually enrich that expertise and make it accessible to people in ways that weren't possible before.
If we can get into that for a little bit before, I know we can talk about some great examples. I know there's a recent New York Times article about a person allegedly falling in love with ChatGPT. And then obviously a lot of us have heard some of the major issues that have affected character AI and other companies. But when we talk about something like your digital twin, there's a well-known early sci-fi short story called Marionettes Inc., where it talks, I love the story, right? Because it talks about this individual who was having a conversation. We said, hey, I'm really tired of having to always have the same discussions with my wife. And then he meets somebody who's selling him a robot that can act just like him, looks just like him, and can replace him. So his idea is, wow, I could save so much time, and I could go golf with my friends, and my wife wouldn't know any different, right? Because again, it's learns who I am. The punchline of the story is that unbeknownst to him, his wife had already replaced herself. So this entire time, talking to this own kind of replication of his wife. I think that's obviously a potential fear that a lot of people have, is as we start, altering ourselves or creating kind of like replicants. At what point does that get into a world where you have bots that are talking to bots?
Yeah, I think that actually you're going to have to share that sci-fi story with me, because I think that's a really strong parable and a great foundation for how to think about AI companions, AI twins today. So just drawing on that story, I think it's pretty interesting. Well, first of all, he aimed to deceive. Okay, so his intention to want to scale himself. Okay, that's pretty like logical, like especially if you're repeating yourself all the time, you don't need to use your full human faculties in order to actually do that job. So, I think that's a very strong use case for why you would create an AI twin. And I actually work with companies whose use case is exactly that, like working with a healthcare CEO who he finds himself having to say the same thing often. And while that's important, it's not the best use of his time. So creating an AI twin that can deliver that message and actually deliver in a more sort of always on, ongoing way in different languages, in a way that's even better than he could in real life. And then he frees his time to focus on work that's more like higher order, that requires him, the real him, to do. That I think transparency is absolutely key. So intent and transparency. And so I think this is where, the sci-fi story kind of goes wrong, which is that he plans to deceive with his AI, with his robot. And it turns out that actually he gets to experience what it's like to be deceived, because his wife has already done it. And and if the objective is a smoother relationship, I don't think that deployment of AI twins or robots has actually helped their cause. So I think it's a very strong parable and something quite useful for us for us each to read and kind of a nice little reference point. So I think that, like, for me, and a framework that I've kind of developed over the last few years, it just seems to be kind of like good checklists are, thinking about responsible avatar or AI twin development, one key aspect is around consent and control. I kind of have it in a sort of that, under control, but consent is absolutely key to that. And if you're going to create an AI twin of yourself, make sure that you consented to it. You know what you are getting into. How it will show up. You feel comfortable with the places and spaces and the people that it might be interacting with. So just really understanding that kind of thing. And the second part is transparency. And we've just covered, some of the reasons why that's important. But I focus a lot, mainly on kind of business use cases. But I think this goes for a lot of kind of like personal engagement as well. You're trying to kind of create trust, right, in communication. Like if you don't have trust in communication, then it's probably going to fail ultimately. Of course, if you're trying to deceive, then, that's another thing. But, bearing in mind that, the objective is to communicate and to kind of build trust, transparency is absolutely key.
Yeah, there's a lot of gray area too. Sorry to interrupt, but I know here in New York, where we're based, that was a major issue a few months ago when they utilized, I think, Mayor Adams' voice and then had him speaking all these different languages and had it in some kind of like robocall type of way. And there was a lot of blowback around that because it's saying, wait a minute, is there enough transparency that this is not, Mayor Adams speaking Mandarin?
Right, exactly. So, if the goal was to, create a message of inclusivity, but instead it gave people a poor impression and it made people pull away, then, that's a failure of the use of the technology. So, yes, I think that if there's ever any case, a good checkpoint is like, if you think there would be any advantage in not being transparent, you probably shouldn't be going there at all, right? So, and I think another checkpoint is, are you creating value that couldn't have existed before that people are going to value? So in the case of speaking lots of different languages that you don't speak in real life, is that going to be perceived as valuable? And maybe it was going to be perceived as valuable, but then you kind of shot yourself in the foot by not being transparent about it. Yeah.
Let's transition into a topic everybody loves to talk about. I'm sure a lot of people tuning in have seen the movie Her, and now it seems like a few popular incidents have brought her to the mainstream type of discussion. I know you and I were briefly talking about a recent New York Times article written by Kashmir Hill, formerly been on stage with All Tech is Human, around a person allegedly falling in love with ChatGPT. I'd love for you to just kind of give your take on that, what issues you thought that brought up, whether you thought it was framed correctly, and then at the same time, I'll be sharing that in the chat for other people to read as well.
Absolutely. I'm just pulling up the title here. I think it's very difficult to report on such stories because people need to kind of like get a sense of what the story is about quickly. And, I think the point.
I think Natalie is just frozen just for a little bit. This is where I love to take some of the audience questions until Natalie gets unfrozen at this moment. As we were just talking about the New York Times article of falling in love with ChatGPT, certainly brought up the major issue of how we think of humanizing chatbots. Right. So what is the impact? One of the things I know on my end, I've always kind of focused on is we seem to be humanizing our technology, but are we kind of botifying our humanity in the process? I think Natalie will also be working on getting back into this live stream if she is currently frozen. But again, I can continue on with some of this discussion as she kind of pulls herself back into this live stream. But if anybody has a question in the chat, I'm very happy to take some of those questions. Since Lena's mentioned that, obviously to the folks tuning in, I think it's also interesting. You mentioned, is anyone working in the guardrails for AI companions or NOAA policies and trust and safety there? So that's something we can start thinking about. But I also see that Natalie is back with a different connection. Hello, Natalie.
Sorry about that.
No, welcome back. Welcome back.
Okay,
I think that was it was frightening for a lot of people tuning in, because they were then worried that you have turned into a robot. I think now you're showing us nighttime in upstate New York. There we go.
Okay. There we go.
So now, Natalie, you were talking about the recent New York Times article of falling in love with ChatGPT. So do tell us some of your thoughts.
Absolutely. So I think that story, which I think you shared in the link, so if people haven't read it before, it's one worth reading. There was a lot of kind of like uproar, like, oh my goodness, how could this woman have fallen in love with ChatGPT? That's got to be wrong. That's weird. But actually, if you dig into the story, there are some important nuances there. First of all, she's very aware that ChatGPT is not a real human, and that's what she loves about it. It's a fantasy, and it's an ongoing relationship that she has total awareness about. Even further than that, her husband is aware of the relationship, and he's totally fine with it. And so, people might bring their own kind of judgments to these situations, but again, this whole space of people's emotions and personal choices, it's very complex and messy, and people have very strong feelings about these things. But according to kind of like an objective way of looking at whether this is an aligned use of AI and AI companionship, and it's totally transparent to the degree that her husband actually knows about it and consents to it. It's like extra consensual. I think that the headlines and kind of the initial sort of knee-jerk reactions that a story like that, when it comes out, produces, is not in line with actually, if we try to look at the nuances and appreciate the nuances of these things, which is hard, that, there are some positive uses which are not necessarily for everyone, but it's not supposed to be for everyone. It's like to each their own. So I think that was an interesting story for many reasons, but I think it's most interesting in terms of kind of like reflecting on it on the details a little bit more deeply, and sort of maybe coming to the same conclusion that I do, that actually, no one is suffering from this. And there's a benefit. She's getting something out of it. But she's not cheating on her husband. It seems to be sort of adding to the quality of her life and their life. So, why knock it?
Well, I think on the flip side, some people might wonder that human to human relationships are messy, right? I'm not a if this then that individual. I'm a real person that is going to be irrational at times. I think some of the concerns that a psychologist would bring up would be around, does that alter our expectations of the human to human relationships, right? If you are having a relationship with somebody who is never going to give you a hard time, or maybe is going to know all the facts, is that something that is going to alter your own behavior once you go back into the relationship? So in other words, you have the two spouses, they might have been okay with this, but then when she goes back to talk to her husband, is her behavior somehow altered? And I also bring up a point that Derek here mentioning the concern. His words, parasocial relationships are one of the risks of teens using AI companions. So you do have a few things that obviously people are going to bring up. If we can briefly transition into that idea of parasocial relationships, that's a concept that gained a lot of steam over the last, dozens of years around celebrity culture, right? So when we think about somebody who's incredibly well known, Taylor Swift, probably one of the most well-known people across the globe, allows us to form this relationship where we think we know who she is, or we're friends with her, we're relating to her, or maybe you're, not a friend with her, maybe quite the opposite, but it allows Taylor Swift as a person to extend out into, honestly, an avatar for humanity, an avatar of, how you interact with people. And now, being in a relationship, we're almost kind of this side partner into it. So any thoughts, Natalie, about the parasocial relationship type of thorny question related to AI companions?
Yes. So, and the reason that I sort of wanted to reflect on that New York Times piece is because, yes, I think there's parasocial relationships can be very problematic and cause a lot of problems for real world interactions, but that doesn't mean that people shouldn't have them. And so the example of the woman in the New York Times is she's someone that actually has not replaced relationships with people in the real world with a parasocial relationship. It's kind of like added to her mix, and she's very aware of it. She's very aligned. It's not affecting her mental health. I think that things become very complex when we're talking about younger people who are more vulnerable, and who might be, replacing real world relationships with these parasocial relationships. So, yes, I think each scenario is distinct, and it comes down to, well, is this person benefiting from this kind of relationship? And if they clearly are not benefiting from this kind of relationship, then it is something, there's some sort of intervention is probably needed. So I think it's interesting because we're talking about like AI companions or like Taylor Swift. I think that in both cases there's some accountability on the part of the parasocial entity in the relationship, right? So the non-human entity in the relationship. So, taking Taylor Swift, she has the responsibility and accountability as a person who has all of these followers, and what level of accountability is she going to take, and kind of knowing the types of influence that she has on people, especially vulnerable people like teens. Similarly, I think platforms that are creating these these identities that people can build relationships with have similar accountability to make sure that they are handling those relationships with care, and that they're guiding those relationships in the right direction. And if the relationship is falling, is actually deviating and becoming like in the case of character AI, there were very clear signs that the boy was very vulnerable, that he was talking about suicide, that there were many points of potential intervention that character AI could have taken. And so I think that especially, I think that kind of AI companion relationships with people, with young people is pretty dicey, and probably and should be managed, accountability from parents to platforms, and all of that. So yeah, I think it becomes extremely thorny, and I think it's important to kind of like look at it on a case by case basis and on a population basis.
Okay. Now, if you don't mind, we're getting a ton of questions, so I'm going to bring up a few, and I think this one really kind of stood out with me. Hello from the Netherlands. Hope to be back to Amsterdam. I think that would be a great All Tech is Human event. I love it there. Anyways, Alexandra's question, I was wondering if this could have therapeutic value for some people to experience romantic relationships with AI agents. They could explore emotions that they perhaps do not feel safe to show to actual people. End quote. Just to give a little bit of context with that too, I know there's been a lot of companies that try to set up, virtual humans, if you will, for exploring kind of like threatening types of environments. People have a fear of speaking, therefore it kind of walks you through that, kind of viewing it as a first step. If that kind of real world interaction would seem threatening, does it loosen that threat to kind of walk through walk through the experience, kind of like we would do with like a flight navigator, right? You train in a virtual environment to hopefully improve the real world environment. Natalie, any specific thoughts on that with romantic relationships?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, simulation is a fantastic use of many types of AI. Practicing interviews,
Hmm.
preparing for situations, running through different scenarios of like handling a situation, at work or with a loved one. It's a great way to practice stuff and to role play. So I think that there is great potential in doing that. Uh, Especially if the intent is that it is just the role play, right? And it
Hmm.
is practice for the real world to kind of build confidence to actually go out into the real world with kind of like renewed confidence. I think that's a fantastic use of it. Again, it becomes like sort of platforms that engage people on that level is great, right? And and communicating that the intent isn't to stop here, like this isn't the
Hmm.
relationship, like this is practice for your relationship. I think platforms that can really kind of honor that, I think that's a great use.
Okay. Another question. Since, like I said, we have plenty of them, a ton of questions. So thank you for all of that. Obviously, we'll probably have to bring Natalie back for either another live stream or in person if you're here in New York or traveling around where we often are. So we have a question here. Once you have a digital twin, how can you ensure that it's only used for what you intended? Great question. And honestly, something I would be afraid of too, around attribution. If I created a digital twin and then, because there are probably lots of statements I say, especially around like all is human, you've got a certain, memorized parts that are always going to come up. Those are easy parts to replicate. But then if it says something that you yourself would not have said, is that going to create a real dilemma around attribution that could potentially get the real person, seemingly in trouble?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first of all, you need to be able to trust that the AI twin that you've created isn't going to do that. And there's a number of
Mhm.
ways that you can sort of acquire that trust. And just to root this in a particular example, I'm advising a startup called Wisely, which
Okay.
enables you to create an AI twin of yourself, a knowledge twin based on your expertise. And then you can make that AI twin available to others to have conversations with to tap into your expertise. So the way that I trust mine, right, and wisely to create mine is that it is exclusively trained on the data that I have provided to it. And it's not trained on any other data. It's not trained on any large language models or anything. So it needs to have sufficient data of my own expertise, but it can only answer from that level of from that expertise. So I think there's a couple of lessons here. One is understanding the data that it's being trained on and the potential outputs. Understand the constraints around the
Mhm.
potential outputs being based on your data. And then I think another way to kind of build trust with an AI twin is to have a very narrow defined use case. So this AI twin isn't going to just be talking to sort of anyone, and anyone isn't going to be wanting to talk to this AI twin. It's got a purpose. And in this case, it's to share my expertise. So it's built in a way that is designed to kind of like deepen the relationship with somebody who wants to get deeper into that expertise. So keeping that kind of narrow sort of use case makes it feel much more containable and valuable and purposeful. You can also another thing that's is the transparency aspect of this. You can see the conversations as they're happening if you want to
Mhm.
look in. Or you can look at them, the transcripts of all these conversations after the fact. So I think there are a couple of components there that help build trust.
Okay. I'm going to bring up, like I said, lots of questions here. So thank you all for that. Let's see Margaret's question here saying, would be very curious to hear your thoughts on AI companions for aging and elderly, particularly those who are isolated or going through cognitive decline that might be helped with companionship. My brain goes to the I think it's called seal that was used in elderly kind of caretaking homes, specifically in countries like Japan, where there's a major difference between an aging population and unfortunately not enough, youth to kind of overtake that. So they were certainly leaning into some of that technology. But Natalie, any kind of thoughts around its usage for companionship with the elderly? Because I imagine that brings up a lot of issues too that can be complex.
Yeah. I think first of all, like, the example of these robots kind of being quite prevalent in Japan, which I think is also a country that leans into robots and like non-human entities and non-human relationships kind of more. It's kind of just more normalized. That I think something that's important about that particular scenario is that there aren't enough people to kind of like necessarily be there to care for the elderly. And so, could you argue, oh, wouldn't it be better if there was, human carers that could be there around the clock for these people? But if there can't be, and a robot or an avatar can actually fill that spot that would otherwise, be empty, like that elderly person wouldn't have that support. I think that that's like a baseline kind of like, oh, well, that seems like a great space for intervene with technology and kind of like AI companionship. So I think that is kind of like, where there's a need and there's no other way to fulfill the need is kind of like a good sort of starting point. And then I think that it depends on the actual deployment, like what's the, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This robot can kind of like perform the very basics, like make sure that that the elderly person is fed, has their medications, etc., and then can kind of like rise up the pyramid towards kind of providing kind of emotional support. And of course there are ways to not just clone your expertise, but clone your persona and kind of can you make yourself available as a family member around the clock through these AI entities? And does that, and again, like if you couldn't be there, so is this now a way to be there? And then also gets pretty interesting in terms of people who might be deceased. Are you able to kind of like bring them back to have, that's a kind of a pretty
that's a whole nother live stream if we get into post-death communication. Obviously, great episode on Black Mirror a few years ago as well. Can go a little sideways, and that actually dealt with attribution as well, where you had the spouse who kind of wanted to do away with that companion after they questioned whether that was really a worthy facsimile of their deceased loved one, or whether it, kind of goes off the rails. Another kind of point that I would think about when you mention using a companion, when that is like the best case alternative, but obviously not as good as a real person. If I'm putting on my sci-fi writer hat, I would say, how does that impact the influence of whether that human would actually interact with the elderly person? So, for example, if I had a grandmother and she could have a AI companion, does the fact that she could have an AI companion of her grandson David, does that mean that I, as an individual, would say, you know what, I could drive 4 hours in the snow to visit grandma, but she's got AI David, therefore do I become less likely to make that drive? And if so, that in itself might defeat the very purpose, because it would lessen the incentive around actual human-to-human interaction.
Yeah, that's an important nuance, and you can see it sort of going both ways. You could even see, I don't know, maybe grandma in that scenario actually prefers the AI version at the time. How sometimes it's, I don't know, sometimes
because maybe they write better thank you letters,
or you don't get into or you don't like descend into like the kind of like the same old things, like.
But that actually, Natalie, that gets back to the earlier part that you and I discussed, is humans are messy, and there's always a lot of concern that, because kind of like appification of our life, if you will, can create a perfection that doesn't exist in human-to-human behavior. Therefore, does that mean that our own human skills atrophy? And then two, does that mean that we prefer the perfect nature of automation because it's not going to push back? It knows what we want. And I think that would be the idea behind the movie Her, is that is Joaquin Phoenix's character, he's thinking that he's having a relationship, but at the same time, really the AI kind of chatbot is not pushing back the way that a real person would. Therefore, it's almost like a way that he has control when in fact relationships are not about control.
Yeah, and I think maybe some people would prefer an entire relationship to be that way, and maybe some people would like the relationship to be that way sometimes. Like some couples, for example, or just family members, like living in different countries and being, having certain days where you're not together, because actually that gives, it's a manageable amount of in-person time, and then kind of like, communication at longer distance, which, maybe is less fraught. So I think it depends on a lot of different things. That said, what I feel, and I can, interesting to see what you think, David, and people who are listening. I'm feeling like the more AI, just communication at large that we see, and as AI reasoning models are getting more and more sophisticated, and the ability to kind of like do and communicate in a way that a human might, there's some sort of just like detachment from authenticity and the actual knowing that there is a human at the bottom of it that actually has human insight and human feelings. And I feel generally, not necessarily in an AI companionship way exclusively, but that this sort of like ability to communicate like a human is untethered from actually being and experiencing the world as a human. And there's this big sort of disconnect, which I feel like is driving us to wanting to be more human ourselves and connect on a human level with others. And I expect that in some cases, in some pockets, and I hope many, but whatever works for people. But I think that the sort of prevalence of AI companionship will actually drive, and the potential for AI companionship and AI relationships and just like AI, I don't know, colleagues and all kinds of AI associates. It will create like more import and on the scarcity of real human interaction and relating. So, and I feel like people are kind of craving that already. So I think that will apply to AI relationships as well.
Just going to bring up a couple more questions, but I know we're going to have to wrap things up pretty soon. But like I said, I think it's going to lead to plenty more, because I see 10 or 15 other questions. We got this one from Slade asking, are there privacy and data security concerns with AI companions? And then he mentions, I think the accumulation of personal data gathered by companions can make users vulnerable to data breaches or misuse of info. Good question, Slater. I can put that back on the screen, Natalie, for you to see that. So what are your thoughts there on, I imagine there's a lot of personal conversations. I know this was actually a huge issue a few years ago for the Hello Barbie that came out for individuals, young individuals, to converse with Barbie that was listening. Created a lot of concerns around what was Mattel's, or what is Mattel's obligation if they overhear something of that's really negative, right? What should they do? When do they step into those scenarios? And then the same part, if that can be breached, you have very sensitive data, because people might treat, and sometimes do treat, their AI companions as a therapist, and that obviously would be highly sensitive data.
Yeah, I think that is just generally a concern with, like, and I would apply the same principles that you may have developed as to kind of what data you just share on the web, right, about yourself. What are you prepared to kind of like share out there, and maybe kind of knowing that it's possible that there could be a data breach is probably a sensible way of going about it. So, you know, so I think that it is a concern. It's something that people should be concerned with. These things are possible, and so just thinking, if this data was available and it was breached, then what implications would that have for you, and is it worth the risk? I guess. And and maybe it's also just looking at the platform itself. Do you trust this platform? Do you believe that they have strong security
in place, and
Mhm.
and certain things like that. So I think it's on a personal sort of basis, but understanding that it could be breached. So I think that's important. And there was another
Okay.
component to the question as well, but
Well, it's just, I think you
yeah,
answered it, talking about that vulnerability with the
yeah,
data,
yeah.
and security types of issues. But for our last question, and again, apologies because I know there's lots of other questions, but would love for anybody who's tuning in to stay in touch with Natalie and Natalie's great work. Right at the end, we'll have you kind of talk about where people can find some of your work and stay in touch. But for our last question, since this one comes up a lot, this idea that we kind of create a human name for our chatbots and companions. So Tricia is stating, I wonder to what extent this is an evolution of what we saw with Roombas. When they first came on the scene, people gave them nicknames. Some even got them mini costumes. Is it our human nature to just always be looking for different mediums of and for connection? So yeah, I
It's a
mean, when
really
we
great
think about
question.
that,
Yeah,
we always create names, and I think that's honestly, if you look at the companies, there's always internal debate around that because you have certain companies that are very intentional about not naming, right, companions and chatbots, and then you have other ones that are saying it's Alexa, right? So they probably ruined it for people's name who actually humans who are called Alexa. They probably
yeah.
changed their name.
Yeah, so I think that we humans have a tendency to anthropomorphize.
Yeah,
I know I mess it up, but you know what I mean.
yeah.
Robots and machines, and actually, there's a really amazing passage in the book "God, Human, Animal, Machine" by Megan O'Gleben, where she basically talks about anthropomorphizing a Sony robot that she gets given. So I think that we do have a tendency to want to relate to things around us. And I think that we also have, a tendency towards fantasy and to building relationships with things which aren't real. Like I think about
Mhm.
characters in movies and video games. Um, so I think that it's a human tendency to do so. So I agree with the comment that that is something that we have a tendency towards doing, and to fantasize in that way, it can be like a very healthy thing. And but I guess it's just like retaining a sense of understanding that like understanding the boundaries.
Okay. Since we were running out of time, apologies for the questions that we didn't get to. There's some questions and comments specifically around children utilizing some of these, and then how that could be difficult around, if we put the onus on the individual to make sure that it's a trustworthy company, right? How do we do that when you have an underage audience and also audiences that might have less digital literacy or media, literacy type of training or digital citizenship type of training. So how do we think of this on a global scale and different ages? Because that is going to be different than you and I that decide, as an educated adult who's in this space. So how do we think of this all across the board? But Natalie, deeply appreciate you coming on today's live stream to talk about these complex issues dealing with AI companions. Where can individuals stay in touch with some of your work? I know you have a great TEDx out there that people can check out. We'll share that in our next newsletter coming out for All Tech is Human next week. But love any ways that you might suggest where people could follow along with your work or get in touch with you.
Absolutely. So probably the easiest way is on LinkedIn. So I'm fairly active there, and I put most of my content on there. I've recently launched a website, which is virtualhumanaeconomy.com, where you can also find more information about my work.
That is great. So I appreciate that, and we'll share those links in a future newsletter with this video as well. Again, I'm David Polgar with All Tech is Human. Stay in touch with us at alltechishuman.org. Natalie, thank you so much for coming on our live stream. And everyone else, enjoy the day. Hope to see you around at future gatherings, whether they are in person or virtual. Thank you all.
Thank you.